The sky over Earth darkened as an enormous alien battleship loomed above the planet. It wasn't alone. Hundreds of smaller warships followed, forming a blockade that covered the atmosphere. Cities below were cast into eerie shadows as people stopped in the streets, looking up in fear. The world had known war before, but nothing like this. This wasn't a battle between nations. This was an invasion. A deep rumbling voice echoed across the planet through every device, every screen, every speaker. Humans, you are prey. Surrender, and your extinction will be painless. The message came from the Zarkith, a ruthless empire that had conquered hundreds of worlds. They did not negotiate. They did not show mercy. They hunted. And now, Earth was their next target. The response from the humans was silence. But deep underground, inside a hidden military bunker, a group of soldiers listened to the message. Captain Bonner sat at the edge of a metal table, staring at the holographic display of enemy ships. He was a veteran, a soldier who had seen war's worst horrors. His face was emotionless, but the men and women around him could see the fire in his eyes. "They think we're prey," Bonner muttered. He stood up, his fingers tapping against the cold metal of his rifle. "Let's show them what happens when you corner a human." The first attack came without warning. From the Zarkith flagship, massive cannons lit up the sky with a fiery glow, launching devastating plasma bombardments. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble in an instant. Bridges collapsed. Highways cracked open, sending vehicles and people plunging into darkness. The world burned. And yet, even as the destruction spread, humanity did not break. Beneath the ruins of New York, in an underground command center, military strategists worked in silence, their hands moving across screens as they tracked enemy movements. General Keller, an older man with a scar running down his cheek, watched as reports flooded in. Entire divisions wiped out. Communication lines severed. Major cities under siege. It was exactly what the Zarkith wanted, a swift, overwhelming victory. But humans had always been different. "Deploy the ghost squads," Keller ordered. Across the battlefield, the real fight began. The Zarkith command post had been established in what was once downtown Los Angeles. Alien officers stood tall, their reptilian bodies armored in thick plating, their yellow eyes scanning for any sign of resistance. They believed they were safe. They were wrong. A shadow moved behind them, then another. Before the first Zarkith could react, a blade sliced through his throat, black blood spraying onto the walls. His comrade turned, but a silenced round pierced through his skull before he could scream. The remaining guards barely had time to register what was happening before the humans struck in full force. Silent, deadly, unseen. One by one, the invaders fell. The human soldiers were different from any enemy the Zarkith had faced before. They didn't charge headfirst into battle like desperate prey. They hunted. In another sector, a group of Zarkith warriors marched through the ruins of an old industrial district. Their scanners detected no movement, no heat signatures. The city was silent, too silent. One of the warriors hissed in frustration. "These creatures are weak. They hide instead of fighting." A human sniper, positioned on a broken rooftop 3 blocks away, listened through his scope. He exhaled slowly, his crosshairs locked onto the Zarkith officer giving commands. He squeezed the trigger. A single suppressed gunshot rang out. The officer dropped, his head snapping backward as dark blood pooled beneath him. The squad panicked. They turned in every direction, but there was no enemy in sight. Another shot. Another soldier down. Then another. They had come expecting a hunt. Instead, they were the ones being hunted. The chaos spread across the battlefield. Zarkith landing zones were sabotage. Supply lines were cut. Convoys exploded before reaching their destinations. Every attempt to establish control over the planet was met with sudden, brutal resistance. And then came the message. In the dead of night, a Zarkith outpost sent a distress call to their flagship. The response they received wasn't from their commanders. It was from humans. The video feed flickered, revealing the inside of the command post they had lost hours ago. The walls were smeared with Zarkith blood. Their own officers lay motionless on the floor, their weapons untouched. A human soldier stepped into view, his face hidden beneath a black visor. He held up a metal plate covered in alien blood. Carved into it were 3 words: "PURUI fights back." The transmission cut off. On board the Zarkith flagship, the Supreme Warlord watched the message in silence. His claws tightened into a fist. This was not how things were supposed to go. The humans were supposed to fear them. They were supposed to break. Instead, they fought like something he had never seen before. They fought like predators. The first days of the war had been chaos. Cities had burned, governments had fallen silent, and billions had been left wondering if this was the end of humanity. But as the Zarkith forces tightened their grip around Earth, something began to change. What was supposed to be a swift conquest was turning into something far more dangerous. The humans were not surrendering. They were learning. Unlike other species the Zarkith had conquered, humans did not follow predictable patterns. They did not fight in ways that made sense to their invaders. They did not wait for rescue or negotiate for peace. They adapted. They evolved. And worst of all, they refused to die quietly. The first sign of this shift came when the Zarkith attempted to capture the remains of Earth's military command. In most wars, once a species lost its major cities and central leadership, the battle was over. But the humans had no central command. Their armies had shattered, but their soldiers kept fighting. Small, scattered units operating independently, each one adjusting to the battlefield in ways the Zarkith couldn't predict. Reports from the front lines painted a terrifying picture. Zarkith forces would establish control over an area, only for their patrols to start vanishing. Supply depots were raided by unseen attackers. Entire battalions disappeared overnight. The bodies of their fallen warriors were never found. At first, the Zarkith believed it was an illusion, that they were simply underestimating the enemy's numbers. But as the weeks passed, the truth became impossible to ignore. Humans were hunting them. They struck from the shadows, attacking in ways that no previous species had. Instead of engaging in open combat, they set traps. They used deception. They studied their enemies' weaknesses and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. And unlike the Zarkith, who relied on brute force, humans used something far more terrifying: intelligence. Zarkith officers quickly realized that the humans were not just using traditional weapons. They were turning their own technology against them. Captured alien weapons were modified and improved. Energy-based rifles were dismantled and rebuilt with increased range and power. Zarkith armor, once believed to be indestructible, was analyzed, and weak points were discovered. Human snipers learned to target these weak spots, dropping enemy commanders with single, precise shots. The humans also understood something the Zarkith never considered: psychological warfare. One night, a Zarkith convoy was moving through the ruins of a once thriving human metropolis. They had been ordered to sweep the area, to locate any remaining resistance fighters and eliminate them. Their scanners showed nothing. Their heat detectors picked up no signs of life. The city was dead. Then they found the first body. It was one of their own, strung up against the side of a crumbling skyscraper, his armor removed, his weapons missing. His claws were broken. His throat had been slit, and carved into the wall beside him were 3 words, written in his own blood: "We are coming." Panic spread like wildfire. Zarkith soldiers began seeing shadows in every corner, hearing whispers in the darkness. Some swore they saw movement in the rubble, only for nothing to be there when they turned. It was a fear they had never experienced before. They had always been the hunters. Now, they were being hunted. Word of these tactics spread quickly, and soon, Zarkith commanders found themselves facing an army unlike any they had ever encountered. Unlike other conquered species, humans were not fighting for survival. They were fighting for revenge. Every soldier lost made them more determined. Every city destroyed only fueled their rage. It wasn't long before the humans stopped fighting defensively. The moment they had enough stolen technology, they launched the first counterattacks. At first, these strikes were small, ambushes on supply lines, assassinations of key officers. But they escalated rapidly. One night, a Zarkith warship orbiting Earth suffered a complete systems failure. All lights, communications, and security feeds shut down at once. The crew scrambled to restore power, thinking it was a malfunction. Then the emergency lights flickered on. Scattered throughout the halls were the bodies of their own security teams, their weapons still in their hands. The bridge had been breached. The captain was missing. And on the main control panel, carved into the metal surface with a human combat knife, was another message. Your turn to run. It became clear that the war had changed. The Zarkith were no longer dealing with an inferior species. The humans had evolved. They were fighting smarter, harder, and with an intensity that no other race had ever matched. Even their tactics in open combat had changed. Human soldiers no longer relied on predictable formations. They used stealth, speed, and deception to their advantage. If an enemy force expected an attack from the east, the humans would strike from the west. If they anticipated a frontal assault, the humans would come from below, using the sewer systems, hidden tunnels, and underground bunkers to launch surprise attacks. The Zarkith warlords held emergency meetings to address the growing crisis. The invasion, which was supposed to have been over in a matter of weeks, was dragging on far longer than expected. Their losses were mounting. Their fleets were vulnerable. And worst of all, fear had taken root among their ranks. No Zarkith soldier wanted to be stationed on Earth anymore. They spoke in hushed voices about ghosts that could not be seen, of whispers in the dark that came before the killing blow. Some even began to refuse orders, claiming they would rather face execution than step foot onto the cursed planet. The supreme warlord of the Zarkith Dominion watched these reports in silence. He had led countless invasions. He had slaughtered billions across the galaxy. But never before had he seen an enemy like this. This was not a war anymore. This was a hunt. And for the first time in history, the Zarkith were the ones being hunted. The Zarkith had ruled the stars for centuries. They had crushed entire civilizations, wiped out species that refused to kneel, and turned thriving worlds into nothing but ashes. They believed they were unstoppable. But now, something was happening that they had never faced before. Fear was spreading through their ranks like a disease. And the worst part, that fear had a name: humans. At first, the war had been simple. The Zarkith had arrived expecting another routine conquest. They had the technology, the firepower, and the numbers. The humans had nothing. Or so they thought. But things had changed. Patrols started vanishing without a trace. Entire squads sent into human-occupied zones never returned. When reinforcements were sent to investigate, they found only empty helmets, discarded weapons, and eerie silence. No blood, no bodies, just an unsettling emptiness, as if their soldiers had simply disappeared into the darkness. Then came the messages. Every time a Zarkith outpost was overrun, a warning was left behind. Sometimes it was carved into walls, sometimes painted in Zarkith blood. The words varied, but the meaning was always the same. We are watching. Run while you can. You are the hunted now. The Supreme Warlord ordered his officers to ignore the psychological warfare. Humans are weak, he growled. They rely on tricks because they cannot face us in battle. Crush them, and their mind games will end. But deep down, even he knew it wasn't that simple. Reports from across the warfront showed a terrifying pattern. Human forces were not just resisting. They were adapting. They learned the weaknesses of Zarkith armor. They studied their battle formations and tore them apart. They even started using stolen Zarkith weapons more efficiently than the Zarkith themselves. And worst of all, they showed no fear. One night, on the war-torn streets of a fallen human city, A group of Zarkith soldiers were on patrol. Their scanners picked up no signs of life. Their heat detectors found nothing. But still, something felt wrong. The squad leader raised his fist, signaling his warriors to halt. The wind howled through the broken buildings, creating an unsettling whistling sound. The Zarkith tightened their grips on their rifles, their yellow eyes scanning every shadow. Then, in the distance, a faint sound. Click, click, click. It was slow, deliberate, like something tapping against metal. The soldiers turned toward the noise, weapons raised. The squad leaders switched to thermal vision, expecting to see an ambush. But there was nothing. Then, another sound. A whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Panic spread through the squad. One soldier spun around, firing blindly into the dark alleyway beside them. The shots echoed through the streets, but they hit nothing. The others started backing up, their tails flicking nervously. Then the shadows moved. A figure dropped from the ruins above, landing silently behind the last soldier in the formation. Before he could react, a blade slit his throat. The others turned just in time to see his lifeless body collapse. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted, but the humans were already gone. The Zarkith fired in every direction, but they were shooting at ghosts. A second soldier went down, a bullet piercing his skull before he even saw the enemy. Then another. The last surviving soldier ran. He didn't care about orders anymore. He didn't care about honor. He just wanted to live. He sprinted through the ruins, his breath ragged, his heart pounding. He reached a partially collapsed building and ducked inside, pressing his back against the wall. His hands trembled as he reloaded his weapon. He was alone now. Silence. For a moment, he thought he had escaped. Then, from the darkness, a voice. "They always run." A gloved hand clamped over his mouth, and the last thing he saw was a cold, unblinking human visor before a blade was driven into his chest. The squad was never heard from again. Back on the Zarkith flagship, commanders were growing desperate. The invasion was not going as planned. Their forces were not just losing battles, they were losing their nerve. Soldiers whispered of death squads that moved unseen, of human ghosts that could kill in total silence. Some refused to sleep, too afraid of the nightmares that came when they closed their eyes. Others started disobeying orders, unwilling to step foot into human-controlled areas. One officer, desperate to prove his loyalty, demanded to be sent to the front lines. "I will show them how a true warrior fights," he declared. The Supreme Warlord granted his request. 3 days later, his severed head was sent back to the fleet in a human supply crate. A message was carved into his forehead. "Send more." Terror had fully taken root. The Zarkith, once feared conquerors, now hesitated before every mission. Every operation felt like walking into a trap. Every patrol felt like the last. Their technology, their ships, their mighty weapons, none of it seemed to matter anymore. The humans had turned the war into something else. It was no longer a battle for survival. It was a hunt, and the Zarkith were the prey. The invasion had started with fire raining from the sky. The Zarkith had landed on Earth as conquerors, expecting a swift victory, expecting humans to kneel. But instead of surrender, they had found something far worse: resistance. And now, the war was changing. For weeks, the humans had been striking from the shadows, whittling down the Zarkith forces one ambush at a time. Patrols vanished, outposts were overrun, and terror spread through the invaders like poison. What had once been an unstoppable war machine was now crumbling under the weight of fear. The Zarkith had expected to dominate. Instead, they were learning what it meant to be hunted. And then something even more terrifying happened. The humans stopped hiding. It began with a single transmission broadcast across every captured human city, hijacking the Zarkith's own communication systems. Every screen, every speaker, every ship received the message. A human soldier stood in the ruins of a Zarkith command center. his face hidden behind a black combat visor. Around him, the bodies of dead Zarkith officers lay sprawled across the floor. The human held up a single captured alien rifle, turning it over in his hands as if inspecting it. Then he spoke. "You came to hunt us." He lifted the rifle, checking its sights, then aimed it directly at the camera. "Now it's our turn." The transmission cut out. Across the warfront, the meaning was clear. Humanity was no longer just defending itself. It was going on the offensive. The first major strike came just hours later. A Zarkith garrison had been stationed in the ruins of an old human city, using the remains of human skyscrapers as defensive positions. Hundreds of alien soldiers patrolled the streets, watching for resistance fighters, prepared for another stealth attack. But this time, the attack wasn't subtle. It started with an explosion. A Zarkith barracks erupted into flames as a well-placed human missile struck its fuel reserves. Fire and smoke billowed into the sky, turning the night red with the glow of destruction. Before the aliens could react, a second explosion tore through their command post. The Zarkith scrambled to organize a defense, their commanders barking orders into communication devices, but the humans had already moved. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops as human snipers picked off Zarkith officers, their modified alien rifles cutting through armor with deadly precision. Down below, human ground teams advanced through the streets, using the city's ruins as cover. They weren't fighting from the shadows anymore. They were here, out in the open, fighting as equals. And they were winning. The battle raged for hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Zarkith had lost their greatest weapon. Fear. Where once they had seen humans as weak prey, now they saw something different. Something relentless. Something ruthless. The garrison fell, and it wasn't the only one. Across Earth, coordinated human strikes hit Zarkith outposts, supply lines, and staging grounds. Human resistance cells that had once worked separately now moved like a single organism, striking at the heart of the enemy with brutal efficiency. They used stolen Zarkith technology against them, hacking into their systems, turning their own weapons into instruments of their destruction. One by one, the cities that had fallen under Zarkith control were reclaimed. The supreme warlord of the Zarkith watched these events unfold from the safety of his flagship, his claws tightening in frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. No species had ever pushed the Zarkith back. No species had ever forced them to retreat. And yet, here they were, losing ground to creatures they had dismissed as primitive. His officers whispered of a growing problem. Mutiny. Zarkith soldiers were beginning to refuse missions. Some had even abandoned their posts, fleeing back to the fleet rather than face the humans. A few had taken the coward's way out, choosing death over capture. The humans had made them afraid to fight. But the worst was yet to come. Days later, a massive explosion tore through the Zarkith's main supply hub on Earth. It was their largest base of operations, the center of their logistical command. Thousands of alien troops were stationed there, along with the majority of their heavy weapons and vehicles. And in one night, it was gone. A human strike force had infiltrated the base, planting charges in key locations before launching a full-scale assault. The battle was brutal. Zarkith warriors fought with desperation, but they were outmatched. The humans moved with precision, working in coordinated teams, covering each other's advances, exploiting every weakness they had learned. By the time the sun rose, the base was nothing but rubble. The explosion had shattered the Zarkith war effort. With their main supply hub destroyed, their forces on Earth were cut off, stranded on a hostile planet with no reinforcements coming. Panic spread through the remaining Zarkith forces. Soldiers who had once marched into battle with confidence now looked over their shoulders at every moment. Officers who had once led with arrogance now second-guessed every order. Then the final blow came. A human fleet arrived. No one knew how they had done it. Human technology was supposed to be inferior, their ships slower, weaker. But somehow, they had built a war fleet, one equipped with the very same energy weapons they had stolen from the Zarkith, and they were using them well. The first human ships cut through the Zarkith blockade with surgical precision, targeting key command vessels and creating chaos in the alien ranks. Then, the ground assaults began. Human troops, now fully armed with hybrid weapons, stormed Zarkith-controlled zones, wiping out the last remnants of the invasion force. It was no longer just a battle. It was a reckoning. The Supreme Warlord watched from his flagship, his mind racing. He had a choice to make: stay and fight, risking total annihilation, or retreat. For the first time in Zarkith history, he gave an order that no warlord had ever spoken before. Fall back. Across the planet, Zarkith ships scrambled to evacuate. Soldiers abandoned their posts, desperate to escape the nightmare they had created. The mighty Zarkith Armada, once the terror of the galaxy, turned and fled from a species they had once seen as nothing but prey. As the last Zarkith warship disappeared into the void, a final transmission was sent to them, one last message from the species they had dared to challenge. A single human soldier appeared on the screen, standing among the ruins of a Zarkith command center. He raised his weapon, staring directly into the camera. "You should have finished the hunt when you had the chance." The transmission ended, and with it the age of Zarkith supremacy was over. The last Zarkith warships fled into the void, their once mighty fleet reduced to a scattered handful of survivors. The Supreme Warlord, once the ruler of 1,000 conquered worlds, now sat in silence aboard his flagship, staring at the ruins of his grand invasion. Earth was lost. The humans had won. But victory was not enough for them. The humans did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They simply watched as the remnants of the Zarkith forces ran like hunted animals. And then they made their final move. The moment the last Zarkith ship left Earth's orbit, a human transmission echoed through the stars, hijacking every remaining Zarkith communication line. Every warship, every outpost, every colony in their empire received the same message. A figure stood in the shadows, backlit by the burning wreckage of a Zarkith command center. A human soldier. His armor was scratched, his visor cracked, but his stance was steady. He stared into the camera, silent for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he spoke. "We gave you a choice." The words were calm, but they carried the force of a storm. "You could have left us alone. You could have spared yourselves. But you came here to hunt us." The camera panned across the battlefield behind him. Dead Zarkith soldiers lay scattered in the rubble, their weapons abandoned beside them. The once mighty invaders were now nothing but lifeless bodies on a planet that had rejected them. The human stepped closer to the camera. His voice was steady, unshaken. "You thought we were weak. You thought we would break. Instead, we learned. We adapted. And we became something else." He held up a Zarkith helmet, its surface dented and cracked from battle. He turned it over in his hands, as if inspecting a trophy. "You called us prey. You called us primitive. But now you understand the truth." He tossed the helmet aside, letting it roll across the ground before it came to a stop next to a fallen Zarkith officer. "We are not prey. We are the hunters now." Silence. Across the galaxy, Zarkith commanders watched the transmission in horror. Soldiers who had once marched with arrogance now felt a cold dread settle over them. They had never known fear, not like this. Then the warning came. The human leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Remember what happened here." A cold shiver ran through every Zarkith who heard those words. "Remember what happens when you try to hunt us." The camera cut out. The message was over, but its impact would never fade. The Zarkith Empire, once the terror of the galaxy, had been marked. They had been humbled, broken, and worst of all, they knew that the humans would never forget. For the first time in their long history, the Zarkith did something they had never done before. They did not plan a counterattack. They did not swear revenge. They stayed away. For years, whispers spread through the stars, spoken only in hushed tones. Other alien civilizations, once fearful of the Zarkith, now watched them with curiosity. Rumors of their defeat traveled faster than light, reaching distant worlds that had long suffered under their rule. Some saw it as a sign of hope. Others saw it as a warning. And then the real horror began. The Zarkith started vanishing. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophic event, but slowly, one by one, entire fleets disappeared without a trace. Outposts fell silent. Colonies that had once been thriving were found abandoned, their inhabitants gone. No wreckage, no distress calls, just silence. At first, the Zarkith High Command tried to keep it a secret. They told their people it was internal sabotage, rebellion, anything but the truth. But deep down, they all knew what was happening. The humans had not stopped hunting. They had simply taken the hunt somewhere else. The Supreme Warlord, now a shadow of his former self, sat alone in the darkness of his throne room, staring at the empty void beyond his flagship's viewport. His empire was dying, crumbling from within. Then a soft sound. Click, click, click. His blood ran cold. He had heard that sound before. Slowly, he turned. In the darkness of the room, something moved. A figure stepped forward, silent as death itself. A human, clad in black armor, visor glowing faintly in the dim light. No weapon was drawn. None was needed. The Supreme Warlord's claws twitched, his breathing shallow. He had conquered galaxies. He had stood over the ruins of empires. But now, at this moment, he knew what true fear was. The human did not speak. They only watched. And then, they disappeared. The Supreme Warlord trembled. He did not need to hear the warning again. He already knew. The hunt was over. But the hunters were still watching. The galaxy had changed. Once, the Zarkith had ruled with absolute power, crushing weaker civilizations beneath their might. They had believed themselves invincible, the apex predators of the cosmos. But that illusion was gone now. Their empire was crumbling. Their fleets were in ruins, and across the void, a new force was rising. Humanity. It had started with whispers, stories of entire Zarkith fleets vanishing without a trace. Outposts left abandoned, with no sign of struggle. Colonies going silent overnight. Some said the humans had struck from the shadows, dismantling the Zarkith one piece at a time. Others claimed the Zarkith were fleeing, running from a terror they could not fight. But the truth was far worse. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were evolving. Their technology had advanced at an impossible rate, integrating stolen Zarkith systems into their own war machines. Their weapons, once crude and outdated, now surpassed anything the Zarkith had ever wielded. Their fleets, once limited to slow-moving warships, now moved like phantoms, slipping past defenses unseen and striking with devastating force. But the most terrifying thing wasn't their technology. It was their mindset. Humans had learned what it meant to be prey, and they had decided they would never be prey again. On the edges of known space, a single Zarkith dreadnought drifted, its crew desperate and afraid. It had been part of a larger fleet, once mighty and proud. Now it was alone, its escort ships gone. They had disappeared in the darkness, picked off one by an enemy that left no trace. The supreme commander of the ship, a hardened warrior who had fought in countless campaigns, stood at the bridge, his claws gripping the command console. His officers spoke in hushed voices, their fear barely contained. They had received no transmissions, no distress calls. Whatever was hunting them was methodical, patient. Then the lights flickered. The ship's security alarms blared. Hallway cameras went dark. The crew scrambled, drawing weapons, forming defensive lines. And then the screaming began. It came from the lower decks first. Brief, panicked bursts of gunfire, then silence. One by one, entire sections of the ship went dark. Soldiers disappeared from their posts. No bodies were found. No blood. Just empty hallways, as if they had never been there. The commander's breathing was heavy now. His officers looked at him, their eyes pleading for orders. But what could he say? What could he do? They weren't fighting an enemy. They were fighting ghosts. A message appeared on the ship's central console, overriding their systems. "We see you." The commander's claws trembled. Another message. "Run." The lights cut out completely. The emergency red glow bathed the bridge in an eerie haze. And then, in the darkness, something moved. A single figure, barely visible, standing at the far end of the room. A human. No armor, no weapons in hand, just standing there, watching. The commander raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the figure was gone. No sound, no trace. The commander fell to his knees. His empire was finished. His people would never recover from this. The humans had become something else, something unstoppable, and there was no fighting back. Across the galaxy, other species watched in silence. Some had feared the humans, others had admired them. But all understood the truth now. The age of the Zarkith was over. The age of predators had begun.